how to pick your way through the minefield of literary theory, which can quite effectively cut you off not just from great literature, but from all the wellsprings of Western culture. The fact is, even if you sign up for a course with Shakespeare or Faulkner in the title, there's absolutely no guarantee that you're going to be taught English or American literature. On the contrary, the professor is all too likely to make use of the literature to indoctrinate you in some ideology that's worse than irrelevant, that's positively hostile to the literature you're ostensibly studying. The professor will be interested in the novels or plays not as great works of art that speak to the human race on themes of universal importance, but as cultural artifacts that privilege white males over marginalized groups such as women and racial minorities. The professor's own politics, Marxism, deconstruction, or some other radical agenda will be the real content of the course. Imagine that you've just arrived at Ivy University and discovered that your English class is being taught by a professor who takes the position that the question is not whether Shakespeare's studies need feminism, but whether feminism needs Shakespeare. She's assigned the following readings, all from A Feminist Companion to Shakespeare. Made to write whore upon, male and female use of the word whore in Shakespeare's canon by K. Stanton. Sycorax in Algiers, Cultural Politics and Gynecology in Early Modern England by Rachana Sadjev. In the Lesbian Void, Woman Eroticism in Shakespeare's Plays by Theodora Jankowski. Misogyny is Everywhere by Phyllis Rakin. She plans to spend the rest of the semester proving to the class that Shakespeare doesn't deserve to be read by women. As far as I know, there is not a university Shakespeare course built around A Feminist Companion to Shakespeare, but that volume is a fair sampling of opinions you might encounter in any university's Department of English. The essays are written by respected scholars with responsible positions in our universities, and the opinions, assumptions, and modes of analysis that appear in those essays are typical of the attitudes your own professor or TA is all too likely to bring to the literature you're studying. If you're a recent college graduate, or if you've spoken to one, you know all about this trend. When Shakespeare isn't being arraigned by feminist professors for propping up the patriarchy, he's being searched for evidence of complicity in the slave trade and the rape of the Americas. Othello and Macbeth and The Tempest no longer have anything to say about human nature, only about racism, sexism, and colonialism. Or rather, the folks teaching English in college seem strangely ignorant of the fact that there is any content to human nature beyond racism, sexism, and similar modes of oppression. Their ignorance seems particularly odd when you consider that they have an enormous body of evidence to the contrary at their disposal. That is, it would be at their disposal if they could bring themselves to pay real attention to the great literature they ought to be teaching, instead of projecting postmodernist ideologies onto it, or simply avoiding the literature entirely and teaching other subjects. English and American literature make up an unparalleled introduction to the wide breadth of human concerns, human capacities, and human wisdom. What you learn in English classes these days is, in contrast, a handful of pinched and bankrupt ideologies, not one of which has as much truth or humanity in it as a single Shakespeare play. The story of one recent graduate is instructive in several respects. Megan Basham reports on what it was like to major in English at Arizona State University, and also on the surprising things that began to happen to her when, despite the best efforts of her professors, she managed to get beyond the superficialities of postmodern literary education and into the literature itself. Arizona State, as Basham herself points out, is more famous as a party school than as an intellectual powerhouse. The attitudes and ideas she describes are not the eccentricities of some cutting-edge innovators. The ideologies that have wrecked the study of our literature were first taken up in our elite institutions, but today they're mainstream, pervasive across the country and throughout all the ranks of our higher education system, from elite universities to community colleges. Basham learned to deconstruct the racist, misogynistic, homophobic subtext of the literature she studied. She noticed that appreciation for John Donne's subtle metaphysical metaphors has been replaced by appreciation for Adrienne Rich's obvious sexual ones. English literature, as it was taught to her, left a lot of room for would-be intellectuals to take up class time debating the homoerotic interpretations of As You Like It and Richard III. Her epiphany came during a survey class that covered medieval and Renaissance literature. She decided there was no point examining the actual texts. She was doing fine giving the professor back the same line he was feeding the class. Chaucer's Wife of Bath's tale was enlightened because of its bold treatment of sexual themes. Spenser's poetry was marred by unhealthy self-denial and recrimination. This system broke down when she was writing a paper of Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur. For the Malory paper, she made the mistake of actually reading the literature and the sources behind it. She then made the further mistake, at least from the point of view of PC English professors, of taking what those texts said seriously instead of dismissing it all as so much unenlightened self-denial and recrimination from our misogynist past. She discovered that the story of Lancelot's guilty relationship with Guinevere offered some insight into the lives she and her peers were living. Like Lancelot, they had at their command opportunities beyond most people's dreams, and like him, they were infected by a certain sickness of soul. An encounter with Christ's sacred chalice changed Lancelot's heart, explains Megan Basham. An encounter with Lancelot changed mine. Self-criticism and Christian faith are by no means the only valuable things you can discover in English and American literature. You can learn to recognize and admire certain qualities that literature paints in all their glory and solid worth: military valor, mental balance, chastity. You can catch the romantic poet's passion for exploring the capacities of the human mind and heart, or the Victorian novelist's fascination with character. Or you can simply learn to love beauty and despise ugliness, to admire skill and know the difference between consummate achievement and lazy bungling. What all these lessons have in common is that it's hard to imagine politically correct English professors being pleased that their students were learning them. This politically incorrect guide will introduce you to the grand range of things that you can learn from literature in English and that you won't have picked up from your college professors. I've tried to provide at least a taste of the greatest literature from every historical period, but there are inevitable omissions and imbalances. Oscar Wilde, for example, probably gets more space than his literary accomplishments warrant, and Edmund Spenser certainly gets much less than he deserves because of the need to cover some important themes from the end of the 19th century on the one hand, and the abundance of fine Renaissance poetry on the other. The lists at the beginning of each chapter include the literature discussed as well as additional works. Together they add up to a curriculum for a self-taught survey of English and American literature. The literary works, themes, and modes of analysis treated in this guide will give you a solid start and help you figure out where you want to go next, but no survey can possibly be exhaustive. There's an almost infinite variety of wonderful literature written in our language, and of life-changing lessons that you can take from it. The one lesson that you can't learn from great English and American literature is the politically correct point of view, the idea that the culture of the West is nothing but a source of injustice, and that only perpetual vigilance against all its isms and phobias can protect us against the return of oppression and misery. If you could learn from our great literature to despise and fear Western civilization, the PC professors wouldn't have quit teaching it. Part 1. What they don't want you to learn from English literature. An introduction to the canon from Beowulf to Flannery O'Connor. Chapter 1. Old English Literature, the Age of Heroes. Heart must be the hardier, courage the keener, spirit the greater, as our strength lessens. The Battle of Maldon. The Old English literature you must not miss. Cadman's Hymn, Beowulf, The Dream of the Rood, The Battle of Maldon. English literature begins with Beowulf, or it used to before PC professors decided that 1. Heroism is irrelevant to modern life, 2. It's impossible to know the truth about the past.